So hey everyone, this is Adam from Social Good Families. I'm here to bring you an expert interview to help us learn more about effective ways that we can engage in social good. And today's focus falls in the category of gender equality, which is number 5 of the 17 global goals established by the UN. If you aren't familiar with them yet, you should definitely look them up, globalgoals.org. And this topic's pretty near and dear to our hearts as we have 4 daughters.
Yeah, gender equality, it's a big deal for us. And I like today's focus, not just gender equality, but gender equality in finance, which is, I think, a unique angle. And we've brought in Elizabeth Cox to speak with us today. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello.
I want to tell you a little bit about her. She is a certified financial planner and a certified public accountant, an enrolled agent with the IRS, certified divorce financial analyst, MIA, International Finance, full merit scholarship, and she went to Columbia University, has a BA there, cum laude, and Middlebury College. So lots of background. Not only that, she has 25 years of financial and investment experience, including more than a dozen years of international bond and equity trading on Wall Street. She was formerly director of international sales trading at Deutsche Bank Securities and head of the Latin American sales trading desk at ING Banking Securities in New York.
Yeah, so we could just say really, really qualified,
right,
to have the conversation about finance. And the intersection of finance and social good may actually seem a little odd, but you'll realize by the end of this conversation why it's so important.
I wanted to interview you, Elizabeth, because I read your blog, which is www.ourmoneyourselves.org. Fantastic content on that blog, and I wanted to actually start with a little quote from it, which says that, thank you. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, we women are reticent to explore our money identities. Too often, even the most accomplished women would rather leave money decisions to others. As a consequence, we have grown to accept a culture and financial system that fundamentally put women at a disadvantage. So those are pretty powerful words. That concept kind of just hit me. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit for us. Give us a little more detail on what you mean.
Absolutely. So I just to go back to the blog and how I came up with the name of the blog, which ties into that comment that you quoted. You know, I felt that, when I was a girl and I grew up in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and the concept back then was, the book that came out that was so famous was called Our Bodies, Ourselves, and it was about women for the first time sort of becoming in touch with our bodies, which up until then we kind of shrouded and never talked about. And I sort of thought the parallel was similar with women, with money and women to this day. To this day, and as you've mentioned, I'm a financial planner. I also am a mom, which I think is one of my very biggest qualifications. And I feel that women that I see, and I do meet with a lot, they tend to put caregiving and other things first, and that has a lot to do with how we think of money. We tend to think of money as a way to give to others, as opposed to sort of providing for our own futures, for our own selves. And my goal has been to kind of put women in touch with the various rules and really complex tax and policy things have come into place that have really, I think, made women second-class citizens when it comes to finances. And there are a lot of statistics that bear this out. One that comes to mind, and I'm hoping we can circle back to this, is that it's very well known amongst groups that women earn 78 cents to the dollar of a man. And actually, if you drill into that statistic a little bit, you'll find that women that are not mothers earn very close to the same as men, actually, especially women, younger women, more contemporary women are earning 95, 96 cents to the dollar of a man until they have children, at which point the number drops precipitously. But a much less well-known statistic is in retirement, women only get 55 cents to every dollar a man gets in retirement. And I really think that this is something that we don't really think about. We think, oh well, I'll worry about that when I get to be older. Oh well, and we don't really think of this as something that should be on the forefront of a woman's movement. And I think what that leads to is women, often older women, they don't have the dignity in their senior years that I think they really deserve. So that's kind of at the forefront of my thinking on this topic.
Wow, I've never heard that statistic. Never thought of that before. That's crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy. And people don't. If you ask women generally, they say, well, I'll worry about that later. Right now I'm raising my kids, or right now I'm taking care of my elderly parents, or right now I'm, whatever it is they have to do, there's always some reason why they'll think about that later. So.
Well, yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about myself. I've never thought, like I said, I've never thought of that before. And I feel swamped as it is. So I don't really know. It's daunting to even think about how would I tackle that problem now that I know about it. What can we do?
Right. So what can we do? So, I thought what the first thing to do is, one slogan that I really like is control our money, control our destiny. So I think that's a really big message I want to get across. And so that you start off, what can you do individually to control your money? And then, bigger picture, what can we do collectively to kind of change the existing policies? So I think that I'll start off by just talking about, two women, I call it Tale of Two Women, that have very similar stories until they approach their situations a little bit differently. So both of these cases are women that have children, and in both cases their marriages didn't work out, and they ended up in very different places. And if you want, I can just go into those details. So the first story is, someone that I worked with over a number of years. We'll call her Emily. And so she lives in Connecticut in a small town, has two beautiful daughters. The marriage, she was married to a husband who had a successful career, and they had what they call irreconcilable differences, so they went their separate ways. And we managed, when I say we, because I helped her with her divorce process, she managed to get a pretty good settlement and income from her ex-husband that was meant to last her for 10 years. And she divorced in her late 30s, and her daughters at the time were 8 and 5. And so we put together a whole plan, and she didn't have a degree, so she was going to go back to school, and she was going to try to work part-time just to kind of keep herself in some sort of a skill set going. But really her primary function was going to be to raise her children, which she felt passionately about, and I also think that's a very important thing. So what happened was she started out and she went back to school. That was good. She managed to get her degree, which was great. And then one of her daughters became sort of I guess you would call her a tennis prodigy. So all of a sudden, instead of following her plan, she ended up devoting a lot of her money that she was getting from her monthly support check to tennis lessons, and then pretty soon it was tennis camp, and then pretty soon the camp was in Florida. And then all of a sudden she was like, oh, well, my daughter, she could be the next Serena Williams. I mean, she's not going to be the next Serena Williams, but she's a good tennis player. But the point is, then all of a sudden she had, through her agreement, she had actually a retirement account, and she started then pulling money out of the retirement account and just thinking, well, if I can just get her through the next tennis season. But then what happened was she, the IRS assesses huge penalties if you take your money out early from a retirement. So that's what happened. She ended up giving close to half of her retirement account to the government in the form of taxes and penalties. And now, her daughter is still a good tennis player, but, that's not her only interest in life. Her older daughter is about to go to college. And I have sort of come to realize that Emily has she's kind of like a deer in the headlights. She doesn't really know how to turn. And, her support payments are about to finish because now we are at year number 9 out of 10. She has no more retirement account left. And it's all really, really daunting. And I guess that's a message to bring across, is that feeling of, it's so easy to just talk about financial planning and numbers, but there's like this whole emotional side that goes along with it. And I realized that actually for the last few years, the whole tennis prodigy thing has been partly because she's too, I don't know if afraid is the right word, but it's really daunting for her to try to figure out a path back to work. So that is a side that is she's only in her late 40s at the moment. So that's a story that we're not sure where her path will take her. But planning, unfortunately, wasn't part of it from a financial point of view.
I have a couple of questions. So she has finished school and has not begun to work. That's correct?
Right. So she hasn't worked in 17 years. So I think that's a lot of the problem. Like, how do you jump back in, after 17 years?
The other question I had was, well, not just observation, kind of really what you said just recently about how there are a lot of emotions tied to the finances, and that's something we don't talk about very often. Your financial plan, and this mom, she wanted to do what's best for her kids, and she's trying to provide the best life and opportunities for them, and so she makes sacrifices, which is what so many mothers relate to. We sacrifice whatever we can for our children, sometimes to our own detriment, and it is emotional. It's very emotional, and so she can then look at her situation and think, but I did what I thought was best for my children, and I don't know, I can relate to that. Just
how do you balance that?
Right.
Right. So that's the thing. So I mean, exactly, I think that was her whole, she kept thinking, if I just do my very best by my daughters, I'll just worry about the future in the future. But unfortunately, the world's a little bit not understanding of that. So, whether that's correct or not, or ideal or shouldn't, it's the fact is here she is in her reality, and it's a scary one, and so it's at this point, it's really hard to figure out, I think it's still, she should go out and try to, because her daughters are both, in their teenage years, and finally she could, I forgot to mention the other thing that she did. This is actually a big part of what happened was when her daughter was so good at tennis, she then started homeschooling her daughters. And so that was like a huge time commitment, of course. And so then that meant even more that it was harder for her to get back in. I think she thought, well, how can I go back to work because I'm actually homeschooling my daughters so they can do these things. So that's just another obstacle that that's in her path. Although now I think they're old enough that obstacle's going away, but it's more like, what is she, she's going to have to sort of start all over again. And I think it's just tough.
Well, and I think the other thing is, as a caregiver, you are trying to sacrifice so much for your children in order to get them where they need to be. But in the end, when you do it to your own detriment, then you could end up being a burden on them later instead of, the sacrifices that you made for them might actually hurt them in the end.
Well, that's true. I mean, ironically, I had a lady that came in last week, and she told me her new financial challenge is her dad, who at the age of mid-80s has run out of money completely. And so now we have to budget, that she has to pay him a stipend every month. And this was something we really hadn't thought about. And you just don't think about that in your financial planning, that now she has to pay her dad. And yet, she loves her dad, but it was just something that hadn't really been factored in. So you don't want to do that to your kids, probably, if you can avoid it.
Right.
So that's the first tale of two women. Is there a happier one?
Yeah. So I have a tale of another client. We'll call her Beth. And similarly, she had 2 daughters, as that happens. And similarly, also, she was married for a while to someone who financially was able to support her. And she knew, I think she knew quite in advance that her marriage wasn't going to work out. I mean, I think a lot of people know these things. And so I think when she kind of figured out that her marriage wasn't going to last forever. And not just because of that, but also because she was a intellectually very curious sort of person. She decided to go back to school when her kids were not, I think they were both in grade school or so. And she went and she studied and became a nurse, and she got a nurse practitioner's degree. And she then decided to work within the school system, because she figured, well, that way when the kids got the summers off, she could get the summers off, and when they have vacation, she could have vacation. And so, if you take a career that's as flexible as that, the problem is you don't get paid as well, because, but the good news is she had job security, and she had a great skill set. So then things didn't work out, and she was kind of expecting that. So so she was a little bit prepared. So on her journey, her financial journey, it actually sort of circles back to what we talked about to begin with. I mean, she took it, she kind of read up a little bit on financial planning, and she actually opened up her own bank account. And she did it, full disclosure to her husband, she wasn't hiding anything. And she would just put, bits of her savings into her own bank account. And then she told her husband, well, he was putting money away for retirement, and she wanted to also put money away for her retirement based on his earnings, which you can do. That's one of the rules. It's called a spousal IRA, and you're always allowed to contribute. So she started doing that, and then that just kind of put her in touch with her money. So then when she finally divorced, she already had her budget all in place, and she sort of knew exactly how much money she needed. And she then decided, she could just earn a little bit more money. It would give her a little bit more flexibility. And she took her career as a nurse in the schools, and, and managed to then actually work for the local town, and kind of turned it into a fuller time position after her divorce. And so she's been able to then, through all of her planning, she's now able to put down the deposit on her home and all those sorts of things. And so she's actually kind of, I would say, thriving in this kind of new world where she's single, but financially really on her own feet. And she's very aware of, all the retirement rules and how to contribute, etc. So I think that the difference is she just kind of put herself in the driver's seat early on. And even though she was spending most of her time raising her kids, she still thought of herself as kind of in charge of her own financial destiny early on. So that just led to her, now she's really kind of flourishing. So it's a much happier story, I would say.
Yes. So that is a good story. I'm curious, we have two stories, both of which, marriage is not working out. I'm wondering about the marriages that are working, but women, that's great. I think it's very common, obviously, these days. There's also scenarios, obviously, a lot of these same scenarios might occur in the death of a husband or partner, but that leads to things like life insurance. Are most women and couples properly prepared in the case of the death of a spouse?
Well, that's a great question. And it's funny, since I am a financial planner and I deal with financial planning software quite regularly, I'm still kind of amazed at how these calculations are done for how much life insurance is required for each spouse. So the way it works is these calculators generally look at, well, if you have any debts, it'll look at that, and then it'll look at the earnings, your earnings, projected earnings for your lifetime, or at least until you retire. And, that's the number that they base the amount of life insurance you need on. So consequently, if a woman is not formally working, or let's say she's, raising kids and therefore not earning as much as her potential would allow, the calculators basically say she doesn't need life insurance. And that's, in my mind, crazy because truthfully, actually I once was working with this attorney who told me such a sad story that it has stuck with me all these years, because he followed that advice of whoever sold him life insurance, and he had a huge life insurance policy on his life, but then sadly his wife, and they had 3 small kids, died very untimely death when the kids were still very small. And even though she hadn't earned money, and so therefore she had no life insurance, he found that he couldn't really do a productive, it took him a while to kind of recover and try to put his life back together. He had to take time out of the workforce to help his kids. His kids really needed him at that time. And so, yeah, I think that that's a great example of how life insurance is really important for both people, and you shouldn't just look at what people are earning.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting what you said earlier. I as you were telling your stories, I have two people, acquaintances I know right now who are in marriages only. They're miserable in their marriages, but they feel stuck there because of finances, which is interesting. This is not to say that if you get in charge of your finances as a woman, that your marriage will fall apart and that you'll whatever, right?
No. Well, no, and exactly, and I think that's one thing I've learned, that you just, whether your marriage, the point is this: you want your center within yourself if you can. As a woman, when you're managing it doesn't mean that you can't, like if your spouse is earning more and you've chosen a more, to spend more time child rearing, that's fine. But that doesn't mean you should then just lose relationship with your money. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Like, just because one spouse earns and the other earns less or doesn't earn, that doesn't mean one spouse should be fully in charge and the other one should just not worry about it. Like, it needs to be a team effort, and that's kind of unnatural. Like, the signals we get don't help us to and so that's why a lot of times with women, they all say, well, not all, but a lot of women, they just say, oh, I don't get it. I'm really not good at numbers. I'm not really, and they make it sound like they're deficient, like they're stupid or something, which it's not that. It's that everything that relates to money they're not seeing it. So of course, it's kind of like, how good are you at a foreign language? Like, you're not born good at it. You learn that foreign language. It doesn't mean you're stupid that you don't speak some language that you never heard before. It just means you have to become fluent in that language. And that's, I guess, one thing I would recommend women to think about. It is your job to understand money. I don't care if you're earning it or not. And there are lots of great resources out there. To be honest, this sounds extremely boring, but one of my this is really boring. This just shows how boring I am. But one of my favorite websites is irs.gov. Honestly, you can go on there and learn all the rules, and it's from the horse's mouth, and it's actually really well organized. So people ask me these questions, and I don't tell them that often. I just go to irs.gov and kind of Google around and find it and go, oh. And then, they think it's from all my fancy training, but really, I'm just going to irs.gov. It's like the horse's mouth. And so they'll tell you what you're allowed to put in your retirement account, how much you can put aside if you're, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a great resource.
And what other resources might be helpful for those who feel completely incompetent when it comes to financial planning?
Yeah, where would I begin if I was, if I'm listening to this interview and I'm thinking, oh, that's me, I want to start. Okay, what do I do?
Okay, so the first thing, I think that the first thing you need to do is just become familiar with what you have. Like, okay, here's your bank account, here's your, one thing I love to look at, and it's not technically my asset, but I think of it as mine, is I go on, and I would recommend everyone to do this. Another good website is ssa.gov, which is Social Security Administration.gov. So, if you can just go on and make yourself an account. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and then you can look and see down the road how much Social Security you're entitled to. I know everyone feels that's on the table, and it could be politically not there when we get to that age. Okay, but you know what? I think you have to make the assumption that it will be, and at least you know what you're entitled to, how it works, how earnings record, like, I can tell you right now, the Social Security looks at your top 35 years of earnings, and it's extremely progressive. So even if you earn $10,000 or $15,000 a year, you're going to get almost, well, not quite the same benefit, but a large part of the same benefit as if you earned I was going to say as much as, Donald Trump or someone. He's not going to get that much more than you if you earn like 10 or 20,000 a year. There are a lot of great websites out there that can help with financial planning. And I just would encourage people, if you're kind of nerdy like me, I like Morningstar.com is one. There are lots of, personal ones as well. But the main thing is just to pick up the newspaper and read and just kind of become familiar with the various rules and what's going on with it, I would say.
Okay.
The other question I had was, you mentioned in the very beginning, well, not directly, but you mentioned, the difference in retirement payment and, just different policies that exist out there that are, sexist, for lack of a better word. So what other policies are out there that we might not be aware of?
Okay, so that's a great question. I mean, I think I like to compare financial planning to healthcare because to me the parallels go on. And right now in our society, people are really aware of what's going on with healthcare. It's, there's Trump Care being proposed versus the Affordable Care Act. And I think people are becoming much more, I don't know if outrage is the right word, but, like we all want the ability to have health care. We all think about it. It's kind of on the forefront of our minds. What we don't realize is that there's another plan that's been put together for retirement. And that is, okay, well, first of all, we have Social Security. We all know about that. That dates back to the 1930s, FDR. And honestly, in the U.S., it's extremely still in that mold. Like, generally, women get benefits on spousal benefits. Often, you can get benefits based on your spouse's earnings history. That's very unique, by the way. I've looked at Europe and other countries, and generally, it doesn't really work like that. Like, you can get credit even, like some Scandinavian countries, for example, they give women that stay home with their kids actually get retirement credits for the service that they're providing. So that's something that, the U.S. could look into, or other people would say, okay, like I told you, the Social Security looks at the top 35 years of earnings history. But like, if you're caregiving, should you get a 0 next to your name for all those years, or should you have, 5 or 10 years that you can actually say, well, if you're caregiving, the denominator shrinks by that many years? I mean, there are lots of ways that we could think about this. But one of them has to do with, the retirement planning and the fact that, as I say, we're not putting money aside. And that's the problem, that women, if we have a flexible workforce, which women tend to prioritize flexibility above all else, right? Like we like to, like the example of Beth that I was talking about, her whole thing was she wanted a job where she could take the summers off, or she could not work when her kids were in school. Like that was her most important thing, way more than the amount of money. But then often the ability to contribute to a retirement plan is tied to, the more structured your job, the more able you are to contribute. So there are a number of policies out there, and I don't know if this is the right forum to go into all of them, but there are a lot of proposals actually to allow, to try to get retirement to be more of an automatic thing. There actually are proposals in New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. Connecticut and California, definitely. I can't remember all the states, but a lot of these states have recommended a retirement plans where you just opt in. So you can work at, a minimum wage job and your money is put into retirement. And they're trying to streamline it. But the financial industry doesn't like this provision because it cuts out on the fees that they're allowed to charge. So when Trump came into office, he basically got the Department of Labor to kind of quash this rule that was needed to bring these retirement accounts to fruition. So I only mention that because there are a lot of rules that we need to become aware, like who right now, for example, we're talking about tax reform. I'm sure you've all been reading about that. The question is, like, who's sitting at that table? Like, how many? We all know that on the healthcare reform that came out recently, that there was a lot of headlines because of the 13 people on the committee. 13 of them were men. None of them were women. But who's talking about the tax reform? Like, how many of those people are men versus women? So I think another thing to look at is like who's writing our policies. And women need to kind of have louder voices on these issues. That's my opinion.
It's funny that you said that it's parallel to healthcare, because it does remind me back in the day when they would do tests, so, the medical testing, control groups, and they were all men. And then those results didn't apply the same to women, and they didn't start, changing that till pretty recently. So it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that with regard to men making the tax rules and that sort of thing, and how it applies to women.
So that's what I think is, I could talk about specifics, but I think it's really just the important point is, don't think these rules are being written with women in mind, because they're absolutely not. Another example, which I just find amazing, is, the concept of having retirement for a couple. I could kind of go along with that. Like, okay, if one partner is putting the money aside, it doesn't really matter how it's titled. Maybe we shouldn't care so much. Like, at the end of the day, as long as you put aside enough, does it really matter how it's titled? But the way things are written right now, you cannot have a joint retirement account, for example. So it has to be in the earner's name. And the only way you can transfer it from, like, let's say it's all in one earner's name, and the only way to transfer to the other partner's name, or to, somehow split the account when you get to be at an age where you're actually going to start taking money out of the account, the only way is to divorce. Like, how crazy is that? Like, how is that a family's value type of system? And so, I am married, and my husband listens to me, bless his heart, because I think he gets a bit tired of it all. But anyway, and I always say that, I'm like, I'm actually having to just put, like, money into my retirement account, because I don't want a power imbalance when I get to be 75. I really, I know it sounds silly, but I don't want to be like asking him for money so I can buy myself a cup of coffee when I'm 75 years old. Like, I don't want that. And the only way I can think to prevent that outcome is to, like, make sure I'm funding my own retirement account, which really is silly. Like, why should that, like, why shouldn't he be able to put the money in his retirement account and just have us share it when we get to be older? Like, wouldn't that be easier? But these are the rules we're living with. And so, and there are just a lot of inconsistencies. For example, tax returns, couples are joint and severally liable. Even if one person is theoretically the taxpayer, the spouse is joint and severally liable. So that to me seems completely inconsistent with the concept that a retirement account can only be in one person's name. Like, the whole, like, are we a unit or are we not? And the rules, the liability is shared and the assets are not. And that's just, odd to me. So.
Wow.
So if you, in a minute or two, if you were to summarize, if a woman is designing her financial life and doing it right, what are the decisions that she should be making that she probably isn't today?
All right. So the first thing is, you need to take charge of your financial life, and that involves saving. There's no other way to put it. You need to be putting money aside. And men seem to get this. This is just, obviously I'm generalizing here, but what I've observed is that men seem to get it. They get it from, and we can talk about why that is. Is it conditioning? I don't know. But all I know is that men generally, even when they're, like, I have two sons. One of them's 23 and the other one is 18, and they're both already thinking about, putting money aside. Like, they're already getting it. So women tend to put their money, they keep thinking, well, let me just buy, this for my kid, or, I just have to, summer camp is coming up. I'll start saving after summer camp, or, my son or daughter needs new clothes. Let me do that, and then I'll start saving. And I kind of, it's not like I don't respect the instinct. It's all from a good place in your heart. It's not to say, but the point is, unfortunately, money works on, it has this kind of what I call like a centrifugal force. It just, like accumulates. It can, you need to start saving early and often so that your money grows. And if you don't, you pay a hugely high price down the road. So that's the first thing I would say. And I also want to make the point, we live in this do-it-yourself financial planning landscape. So no one's doing this for you. You absolutely have to do it yourself. Don't rely on somebody else. So that's one thing. The second thing I would tell people is be careful with debt. Actually, I read an article. I don't know if you guys saw that article. It appeared in, I think, yesterday's New York Times, and it was about how we finally, as a society, have reached the debt levels that we have reached in the year 2008. And I guess I feel that some debt is, you need it to build, if you want to buy a house, for example, et cetera. But just remember, when you take on debt, you are borrowing from your future. You are borrowing from your future earnings and your future income. So if you don't expect to be earning a lot in the future, don't borrow. It's as simple as that, And other things that I would recommend is just, keep on top of your budget. Just there's so many great budget softwares out there now, and it's actually kind of fun. And I mean, in the old days, we used to have to kind of do pens and papers and checkbooks and things like that. But now you really can just, have your bank accounts uploaded to a software and kind of categorize it and tell yourself, and that's what I do a lot for financial planning. There are ratios you need to think about. Don't spend more than 28% of your income on housing, for example, that kind of stuff. So track your spending. That's really crucial. Track your saving. Everyone should have a savings rate. There are a couple of rules of thumb. If you start at age 20, you should be saving about 12% of your income a year to give yourself a retirement in the living style to which you have grown accustomed, as they say. But if you wait till 30, that number jumps up to like 20%. And people that wait till 50, I mean, you may as well just be putting your entire paycheck in the bank, which is impossible, obviously. I was kind of joking. So those are just a few of the takeaways I would suggest.
Okay.
Great. And I like that I was thinking in terms of families, like, could those be considered challenges?
Yeah, that I would definitely stress that, well, actually, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Warren Buffett, the famed Oracle of Omaha, as he's known. And he's the one who said, don't spend what you, I'm trying to remember how he put it. He said, spend what you don't save what you don't spend. I don't know if I put that right, but the point is figure out what you need to save, put it aside, and then you can spend the rest. Don't spend and figure out what's left and put it into your piggy bank, because guess what? There won't be anything left. So you have to figure out first, put 10, 20%, whatever away. And a lot of times people think, well, that's just really boring, and why would you do such a thing? But I'm young, and who, I'll worry about retirement later. But it's not just about retirement. It's also, let's say, you need to buy a new car in 3 years, for example. Where are you going to go? Well, if you've been putting your 20% savings away, that's where you're going to go. You're going to go to your savings to pay for your car. Like, that's so much better than having to go and be at the mercy of some creditor, right? I mean, so that's a definite takeaway, and it's kind of something fun. And I also, as I mentioned, there's a great software called You Need a Budget, and you can look at that. And, you can be young and do that. You don't have to be like, and just kind of play around with all the charts that it gives you and stuff.
Well, yeah, I remember even as a child having a little bank that had, some for savings, some for spending, and we do that with our kids too. You can start at a really young age. So, as you said, one of the challenges would be saving. So that applies to young and old, every age. They can be putting,
right,
whatever percent of the dollar that they got from the tooth fairy to a savings if they want to, or whatever.
And you don't have to, I think like people think retirement, I mean, how abstract is that, especially for a child? Like, that is just something, you just say, for something really fun later on, like, that's when they get it. I mean, even I've worked hard with my kids to try to explain. Some of them get it like right away. And one of my sons is a spender, but if he's starting to finally get it. It's been a hard journey.
Any other little challenges that we can adopt?
Or other thoughts that you wanted to share with us before we finish up?
Well, I think that the main thing is money is something that I think it's something you need to become comfortable with, and not think of it as this. A lot of, dare I say, women. A lot of times, women think of money as something that is like the opposite of social compassion, sort of the things they want to do, and instead, money becomes. But money is like without no pun intended, it is a currency, and it is like a language, and it is something it is a challenge just to learn about it. So I think. Learn the various tips of what is a savings account, what are the rules. And I'll mention one other thing. Be aware, actually this is something I really want to leave people with, which is you have to look at what we call money messages. Like, we are a society that is absolutely inundated with consumer messages all the time, wherever you go. There are ads everywhere telling you to spend money, telling you how to part with your money. But there's nothing counterbalancing that. Like, there's nothing on the other side saying, save your money, right? Nobody ever tells you that. They just tell you to spend it. And I guess I feel that, unfortunately, the reason I like it, I'm kind of a skeptic at heart, and I recognize that there's no one to protect you out there, really. And so you just have to kind of go through life kind of with this skeptical, cynical attitude, and I think it will serve people really well. So what does that mean? That means, when someone wants to sell you something, you have to ask, what is their motivation? Is it to make money off of you, or are they really trying to help you? And I think we see that a lot in financial planning. And people that are trying to sell you stuff, they're not doing it because they're trying to get you on a stronger financial path often, but rather just to make a quick buck. So I would definitely tell people, when they're actually saving, look at the cost of whatever the vehicle is that you're putting your money into, and just make sure that you're being a really vigilant consumer.
So as you were saying that, I'm thinking about my own children, and how, they will see billboards or commercials or whatever, and then they'll want products. And something that I can do then is have a conversation with them and say, okay, so this is a company and they want to make money, and so that's why they're doing this, and it worked because you want it. Okay, but then what are we actually benefiting? Just a conversation about ads and that kind of thing to kind of help them have an awareness, because like you said, nobody's telling them the other side that these companies aren't in it for their best interest, right?
Right.
Or for their children's best interest. They're in it for their own best interest. And, I don't know. Having a conversation, I think, would be really helpful.
I think that is really helpful. And I guess what I'm also thinking is, how do you show a child, actually, you have $1 and you spend it, or you have $1 and you save it. And then the question is, how can you illustrate how to make that dollar grow, so to speak? Like in the old days, we used to put it in the savings. I can't remember those savings books. And I remember my mom would drive me down, and you get those books and you'd put in $1, and then you'd come back 6 months later and it was like $1.05 or something. And you could be like, oh, look, it's worth $1 and a nickel or whatever. And now, it's very hard. It's much harder because interest rates are basically zero or very low. So it's harder to show. But, you could even, for the more ambitious parents out there, you could go out and buy your kid a stock holding, just something really small, like the S&P 500 or something, and just say, okay, as the economy grows, your money grows or something. And you can just buy like a little index fund, just, spend a couple $100 even or something if you have that kind of money to give your kids, and then just watch it grow. And then they can understand, like that $100 grew to $120 or whatever the amount, versus just spending it and it's all gone. So that might be another good exercise.
Interesting.
I like that. Well, a lot of really helpful information, and hopefully we definitely, and our listeners have now better understood the connection between finance and gender equality. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for what you do and sharing this info with us. If people want to learn more about what you are doing and how they can get involved, where do they find you?
Well, you can find me on 2 different websites. One is my blog, which Holly mentioned at the beginning. It's www.ourmoneyourselves.org. And I also work as a financial planner at Merit Financial Partners, allspelledout.com. One of those two places.
Perfect.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for listening. You can learn more about what we are doing at socialgoodfams.com and on Instagram and Facebook at socialgoodfams. Stay tuned for our next expert interview. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.